A weirdly common problem in Final Fantasy XIV, possibly especially because of the age of the game combined with the amount of changes the game has got over the years, is that some players will claim that something is true without ever checking if it actually is. Either because they assumed it is the way they think, or because it was like that at some point. Welcome to Final Fantasy XIV Mythbusters, where I and my friends highlight the odd claims and misconceptions players make, and test them to see whether they are true or not, while also explaining how you can test it yourself so you can learn how to science stuff in Final Fantasy XIV. Number 1. Walking Dead resolves by reaching max HP, not from healing 100% of your HP. False. The tooltip itself kind of gives this away, but sometimes a tooltip might be misleading, especially when it is trying to convey something weirdly complicated in a simple way. If, before the Walking Dead timer runs out, an amount of HP totaling your maximum HP is restored, the effect will change to Undead Rebirth. This means you need to heal for a combined amount equating to 100% of your HP, and that it doesn't actually matter how this is received. In a previous episode of Final Fantasy XIV Mythbusters, I demonstrated that either overhealing counts, or your HP -1 is enough. Either one is fine. Point is, you cannot die as a result of not being able to contain the necessary healing. This time, we will demonstrate that you just need to receive the healing. How to test this then? You need a Dark Knight and enemies. Enter duty synced. Challenging enough that it can easily kill you over and over in short order. Also, make sure you are at least level 50 in said duty. When you're about to die, use Living Dead, and wait. Once Walking Dead activates, immediately start using single target attacks to heal yourself. Due to the scaling of the heals from Walking Dead, this will rarely ever immediately heal you up fully. What should happen is that you will gradually heal up, but Walking Dead will turn into Undead Rebirth, notably before you reach max HP. As you can see here, for me, I reach Undead Rebirth with around 90% HP. Number 2. The ads on Ramuh Extreme reduces the soft enrage timer with increased sentence. False, and yet, in a real fight, this can be extremely hard to demonstrate due to the chaos in the fight itself. Despite this, it is somewhat commonly accepted that the increased sentence mechanic actually reduces the timer on the soft enrage, which, it turns out, it does not. Kind of. It turns out the way it actually works is that when the ad phase begins, Ramuh has a hidden boss gauge that fills, and each increased sentence that goes through increases the gauge. And the more full it is, the more damage it does, and at some point it reaches its peak, massively increasing the damage leading to an enrage. However, regardless of whether the gauge is filled or not, Ramuh will not forcibly use Judgment Bolt before either all the ads are gone or 2 minutes have passed. After about 2 minutes, the gauge will always be full somehow. Based on how it reacts, presumably Ramuh just forcibly fills it fully on the 2-minute mark, which is why the ads are redundant at that point. However, if there are enough ads alive for long enough, Ramuh can actually reach the enrage damage threshold before the 2-minute mark, so you can successfully kill the ads and then promptly die anyway. Ain't that something? Now, that is a lot of claims from me with no evidence whatsoever, so how would you test this? First, enter Ramuh Extreme unsynced, reach the ad phase, and simply do nothing. You will see that Ramuh will use Judgment Bolt for around 34,000 damage after about 2 minutes. Next, do it the exact same way, but this time, kill off all but one ad as quickly as possible, and observe that once again, Ramuh will Judgment Bolt for about the same damage after 2 minutes. So we know the hard stop here is 2 minutes, and the ad count doesn't actually matter. Next, go in again, initiate the ad phase, but this time, after around 90 seconds, kill off all the ads really quickly. Notice that the damage is still around 34,000 damage. The enrage amount. Strange. Then let's try this again, but only keeping one ad alive until 90 seconds. This time, it hardly hurts at all. Let's try with all the ads alive, but only for 1 minute. This time, it hurts a lot more than with just one ad for 90 seconds, but still survivable by an actual level 50. Finally, let's try 90 seconds with all except one ad alive. Again, it hurts, but is survivable by an actual level 50. In other words, the way increased sentence actually works is that it fills an invisible boss gauge, and the more full it is, the more damage Judgment Bolt does. However, Ramuh does not seem to contribute to the gauge at all on his own, aside from forcibly filling it after about 2 minutes. However, it does seem that as long as 1 or 2 ads are killed off in the earlier half of the phase, you have the full 2 minutes without having to worry about Ramuh fully peaking beforehand. The key thing to note here is that increased sentence technically does not cut short the ad phase, but can make Ramuh reach the enrage damage amounts early. Very weird functionality, but it does mean that in broad strokes, as long as you kill off the ads gradually, the ad phase is always 2 minutes. Number 3. Most mobs don't care much about your vertical position. But how much do they care? In a previous episode, I mentioned that mobs don't really care about your vertical position, and will hit you anyway. This was based on the implication that in most fights where it really matters, you're fighting in a flat arena and jumping does not help you at all, as it would never move you high enough vertically to dodge anything. However, that brought about a follow-up question. Let's say someone is fighting an open world mob and you fly over them. How high up would you need to be for a telegraph attack to miss you? So, how does the test go? My assumption is that certain attacks might have different maximum vertical range. However, we can make a general estimate by checking a telegraph. Just one. As such, we will find a random mob in the open world with a telegraphed attack. I will have a friend fight it, and I will be flying above. Every time it strikes me with the attack, I will fly slightly higher up, until it stops hitting. To test this, Cradle is helping me. I start the test here at almost ground height, and move up slightly every time rail cannon hits me. And, as you can see, we go higher and higher and higher. But exactly when I am above the delta's HP bar, it stops hitting me. From this test alone, there are 2 possible answers at least. Option 1. The height of any attack is approximately the floor of the user and up to their HP bar. Or option 2. Delta, by complete coincidence, just so happens to be exactly the height of the attack. For a secondary test, a common problem in PvP for black mages is verticality. Super Flare weirdly stops landing when enemies get just slightly above the black mage, it feels. We can use this to test some more. First, let's test how far down Super Flare lands. I apply Blizzard to this dummy and use Super Flare at this awkward angle, where I am just above the striking dummy. This connects. Then I do it again, but on top of this cannon here. Now it doesn't work. Next, we test upwards verticality. I apply Blizzard to this dummy and use Super Flare, and it connects. Off camera, I kept testing to find the spot where it stops working, but actually it connects almost all the way down the staircase. Only here does it stop working. Something I think is interesting to note is that the upwards verticality seemed similar in height to the delta, but I do think it was significantly higher, which leads me to believe there is a possibility that the height of an attack is more about the attack than the user. As in, each attack might have its own unique vertical range. But I don't know for sure. It is also possible PvP actions are just programmed differently. With that said, under most circumstances, it seems like verticality is a minor detail. Number 4. As an astrologian, if I have a melee card but no melee DPS, is it better to play it on the tank or the ranged DPS? Conversely, if I have a ranged card but no ranged DPS, is it better to play it on myself or the melee DPS? This is a rather common predicament when doing dungeons in random groups as an astrologian. The first thing to keep in mind is that when drawing cards as an astrologian, your first priority should be getting a sign you want, meaning that you only redraw if the sign is one you already have. This is because if you redraw with a sign you don't have because you wanted a card aimed at a different role, then you're actually equally likely to get a sign you don't want as one you do want, and you're also equally likely to get another card you don't want as one you do want. Meaning, redrawing in this situation is flipping a coin between getting something slightly better or way worse. It is not worth it. With that out of the way, we land at the predicament in the original question. We have two group compositions to consider. R, tank to ranged and yourself. And M, tank to melee and yourself. For group R, if you get a melee card, you have to choose between boosting the tank's damage by 6% or a ranged job's damage by 3%. The important thing to consider here is that tanks typically do about 2/3 of the damage of an average DPS job. Naturally, the power difference between DPS jobs is quite significant, so for some DPS jobs the tank could be closer to 70% or 80%, and for others closer to 50%. However, if we assume this average applies universally, and both the tank and DPS is playing well, then playing a melee card on the tank will be equivalent to a 4% damage boost to the DPS, where playing the card on the ranged DPS would only be worth 3%, remember? On the other hand, for group M, if you draw a ranged card, you're choosing between 6% damage for yourself or 3% for the melee. On average, a healer will be able to do around half of the damage of an average DPS job. Again, with some variance. However, Astrologian specifically is kind of on the weaker end of personal damage among the healers. Not surprising, meaning it is far more likely you're doing, say, 40% compared to the average DPS. In other words, if you play the card on yourself, those 6% will be closer to equivalent to 2% damage increase for the melee DPS, where playing it just on the melee DPS would be just 3%. In other words, if we assume these averages all just apply, then in a dungeon group with 2 ranged DPS, playing a melee card on the tank is usually better. In a dungeon group with 2 melee DPS, playing a ranged card on the melee DPS is usually better. However, the conversation is a bit more complicated than that, which some of you may recall from my discussion about closed position in a previous episode. If the tank is kinda bad, then playing melee cards on them is not worth it. If the melee DPS is kinda bad, then you might actually prefer to play the ranged card on yourself. Another factor is also that these power comparisons are usually made on single target damage, and dungeons involve a lot of AoE, and jobs scale weirdly on AoE. For example, most healers already start to use AoE attacks on 2 targets due to how that scales. And most DPS jobs don't switch to AoE before 3 targets, suggesting theirs scale a bit slower relatively speaking. That is to say, it is possible the gap between roles close in more on AoE, and this can also be a factor to keep in mind. Yet another factor is also in regards to when your card is being played. A melee card played on the tank when they just finished inner release and are now just doing filler will be much worse than playing that card on that black mage that just put down their ley lines. Cooldowns drifting apart in a group is very normal in dungeon content, so this is also a factor that can play. Who is currently popping off and who isn't? Which is quite a long-winded way of me saying that I can't really give you a conclusive answer that perfectly matches for all of your groups. However, on average, if we assume everyone is about equally skilled, playing melee cards on the tank in a ranged DPS group and playing ranged cards on the melee DPS in a melee group is a pretty good default strategy. Finally, just to note, when I say, for example, that a tank can do 2/3 of the damage of an average DPS, that is based on log data and includes crits, direct hits and other random factors such as buffs at times. Number 5. Does intervention increase damage reduction if you use Rampart or Sentinel after applying intervention itself? No. I don't think I would even need to test this to convince most players that intervention does not work in this way. When intervention is cast, it checks whether you had Rampart or Sentinel active and then gives the target a buff with an effect according to whether it was or was not active. If your state changes, intervention no longer cares the moment it is placed on someone else. It snapshots. This is probably for the best, because if intervention's effectiveness changed based on whether you activated Rampart, it would also mean that if Rampart ended during intervention, its effectiveness would drop in the middle. Now, how would we actually go about testing this? You will need your Chocobo companion for this. Find a mob that your companion can reasonably fight. Once it has aggro, use intervention on the Chocobo. See how much damage the Chocobo is taking. Then intervention again, but this time then use Rampart or Sentinel and see that the damage is about the same. Something to keep an extra close eye on is that intervention applies an extra 10% damage reduction for the first 4 seconds. So, keep that in mind. Next, for the sake of comparison, use Rampart or Sentinel and then intervention, and note that the damage is significantly less than before. Again, remember the first 4 seconds of intervention is a bit stronger. Just as a reminder, intervention as is reduces damage taken by 10% and 10%, which combines for 19%. If used with Rampart or Sentinel active, it reduces damage taken by 20% and 10%, leading to a combined 28%. Hilariously, Holy Sheltron being 15% and 15% adds up to 27.75%, meaning intervention at its peak is actually better than Holy Sheltron. I have a separate video on the subject of diminishing returns if you want to learn more. Number 6. Art of War is a gain on 1 in a certain level range. True. This is a rather minor thing, but it seems like a classic misunderstanding at this point. Ruin 1 for Scholars starts at a potency of 150. Art of War, which is learned at level 46, also starts at a potency of 150 per target. This means that Art of War in a single target fight is like an instant melee range Ruin 1. At this point, we probably agree that they do the same damage. However, if you are in melee range and enable auto-attacking, you will swing at enemies every 3.12 seconds, depending on the delay stat on your weapon, and in the level range of around 50, your auto-attacks, even in optimal healer gear, will be somewhere in the ballpark of as strong as about 30 potency of your spell damage, perhaps more. When you cast a spell, your auto-attack timer is delayed by the cast time minus half a second, slide casting time, which means that casting Ruin 1 delays your auto-attacks by 1 second. If we assume that your auto-attacks are just worth 30 potency in this level range, then Ruin 1 in melee range comes at a cost of 10 potency due to losing a second of auto-attacking. Meaning Art of War is, in fact, a gain on 1. This is no longer the case at level 54 when Broil is learned, as Broil 1 has a whopping 220 potency. And while Art of War is upgraded to 165 potency at this level, that is of course not good enough anymore for single target. Number 7. How was the dragon fight in Labyrinth of the Ancients actually supposed to go? In some regions, the standard strategy against this dragon is to move it to Narnia so the skeletons have further to run, and then just hope and pray the healers can spam heal through the damage. In other regions, you just keep the dragon on the edge of the center circle and just AoE all the skeletons as they spawn so most of them never make it. It is probably reasonably obvious that this is not at all how the fight was supposed to be done, right? One thing that stands out to me weirdly about the skeletons is that when they rise up to run at the dragon, they suddenly have purple beams between them indicating something. It turns out that the skeletons being close to each other give them a monstrous speed buff, or rather, as it turns out, removes a gigantic heavy debuff on them. So how was the fight actually meant to be done? Well, from what I can find, the dragon is fine to be in the center, on the edge so it doesn't breathe on everyone. But the skeletons actually spawn in pairs every 25% of HP on the dragon. That way, you can have the two off-tanks each grab a skeleton and move to Narnia, off to the edge of a platform each. And you have plenty of platforms, more than 6, so you do in fact have a platform for each skeleton. To demonstrate what happens when done in this way, I have brought Aradel and Sip to help me. Notice how insanely slowly the skeletons run now that they are alone. It takes them an eternity to actually make it to the dragon, so it would be outright trivial to kill all of them in time. This appears to have been the intended way of beating this boss. Every 25%, you pull skeletons away to platforms, kill them, and then once all 6 skeletons are down, you kill the dragon, and get ready to kill the skeletons again. You do this twice, and then when the last phase comes and instead Ahrimans spawn, well, I'm not entirely sure about them, but I suppose you'd want to kill those off too if you can't kill the dragon before they become a problem. Based on how we normally defeat this boss these days, regardless of which of these 2 strategies you prefer, we can probably agree that it makes perfect sense why we no longer do this fight properly, so to speak. Totally unnecessary, synced, and way faster to just bomb rush it like we do. Have you seen or heard about some absolutely ridiculous myths in Final Fantasy XIV that you would like to have explained or demonstrated? I would love to hear about them in the comments. I would like to thank Sip and Aradel for helping with some of the tests in the video. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, you may recall that black mages only swing for 1 damage at max level. They swing for more damage at lower level, which I have demonstrated in a previous episode. This is due to how stat scaling works. Scholar and Summoner, unlike all other casters, seem to gain enough strength per level up to at least still be gaining auto attack damage. Unfortunately, it can't keep up with their gains in magic damage, which is why, while the auto attack damage is more than nothing at max level, the book's max are hardly something we can consider important.